The final voicemail from that roadside cabin, chilling truth on a cold stretch of rural highway, a voicemail surfaced that investigators later described as the last known trace of a missing man. The recording came from a roadside cabin that had no listed owner and no clear record of who stayed there. Garen Pike was 34 years old and worked as a freelance surveyor who spent most weeks mapping remote land parcels. He had taken a short contract near an unnamed county road, planning to finish measurements before the end of that week. Locals later said the area was quiet, mostly pine forest and old utility lines, with a single abandoned cabin near a gravel turnoff. Garen checked into a budget motel on Monday afternoon and told the front desk he would be out working late most days. His goal was simple: finish the survey, submit the data, and drive back home before the weekend traffic built up. On Tuesday morning, he drove his pickup along the county road, following faded markers left by a previous survey team. By early afternoon, his GPS logs showed he stopped near the gravel turnoff, roughly half a mile from the abandoned cabin. He sent a short text to a colleague, saying the signal was weak, but the site looked manageable for a quick job. Around 5 that evening, a nearby resident reported hearing a vehicle idle for an unusually long time near the tree line. The resident did not investigate, assuming it was a contractor finishing work before heading back toward the highway. At 6:23, Garen made a phone call that lasted exactly 42 seconds, but no audio was recorded on the line. Call logs later confirmed the number dialed belonged to his own voicemail, triggered manually instead of through a missed call. Investigators would later focus on that detail because it suggested intent rather than a simple connection error. At 6:24, the voicemail began recording, capturing a low hum and faint wind pushing through what sounded like loose boards. Garen's voice came through clearly at first, steady but strained, as if he was trying to keep control of his breathing. He said, "If anyone hears this, I need this on record. Something is wrong out here, and I am not alone." There was a pause, followed by footsteps on what sounded like wooden flooring, each step uneven and slightly delayed. He continued, saying he had gone into the cabin to check for a higher vantage point, hoping to get a better signal. Inside, he claimed the air felt stale, and there were signs that someone had been there recently, despite its abandoned appearance. He described a chair pulled toward a window and a small table with what looked like fresh scratches across the surface. At that point, his voice dropped lower, and he said he could hear movement beneath the floor, slow and deliberate. The recording picked up a faint dragging sound, like something shifting across dirt or loose gravel directly under the structure. Garen whispered that he had tried to leave, but the door would not open fully, as if something heavy blocked it from outside. He said he had not heard any vehicle approach, and there were no visible tracks leading up to the cabin entrance. The wind grew louder in the recording, rattling the frame, while a second set of sounds began to overlap with his voice. It was unclear at first, but later analysis suggested a rhythmic tapping, uneven and too deliberate, to be caused by loose debris. Garen moved toward what he described as a hatch in the floor, partially hidden under a warped piece of plywood. He said he did not remember seeing it when he first entered, which raised questions about how long he had been inside. The recording captured him pulling the board aside, followed by a hollow echo that suggested a space larger than expected below. He hesitated, then said quietly that there was a light down there, faint but steady, not flickering like a natural source. At 6:26, his voice sharpened, and he said, "There is someone down there. I can see movement, and it is looking up." What followed was a sudden thud, as if something struck the underside of the floor with force, causing him to stumble backward. The voicemail continued, capturing heavy breathing and the sound of something scraping closer to the hatch opening. Garen tried the door again, his footsteps quick and uneven, but the handle rattled without giving way. He said he could feel the floor shifting slightly under his weight, like something below was pressing upward from beneath. The tapping returned, louder now, and closer to where he stood, matching a pattern that almost sounded intentional. At 6:27, the recording cut briefly, then resumed with a sharp intake of breath and a single word spoken clearly. He said, "It knows." The voicemail ended seconds later, leaving only the hollow sound of wind passing through the cabin walls. When Garen failed to return to the motel that night, the front desk noted his absence, but did not report it immediately. It was not until 2 days later, when his employer could not reach him, that authorities were contacted and a search began. Deputies followed his last known GPS point, leading them directly to the gravel turnoff and the abandoned cabin. They found his pickup parked at an angle near the trees, keys still inside, and no signs of a struggle in the immediate area. The cabin door stood slightly open when they arrived, with no visible obstruction preventing it from moving freely. Inside, the air was still, and the floor showed faint marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across the boards. Near the center of the room, they found a loose piece of plywood, partially covering a dark opening beneath the cabin. One of the deputies later reported a faint draft rising from below, carrying a smell that did not match the surrounding forest. The voicemail would be reviewed that evening, marking the first time anyone heard what Garen Pike experienced inside that cabin. Deputies secured the cabin that evening, documenting every visible detail before attempting to access the space beneath the floor. One officer used a crowbar to lift the plywood fully, revealing a narrow opening reinforced by old wooden beams. A faint draft continued to rise from below, carrying a damp, earthy smell that did not match the dry forest outside. They set up portable lights and lowered a camera first, recording what appeared to be a shallow crawlspace. The footage showed packed soil, scattered debris, and what looked like impressions in the dirt that did not match animal tracks. Those impressions appeared elongated, almost like dragged lines, with irregular spacing that suggested uneven movement. After reviewing the footage, one deputy entered the opening, carefully lowering himself into the confined space below. He reported that the ground felt recently disturbed, softer in certain areas, as if something had been moving through it. About 2 meters in, he found a small object partially buried in the soil, which turned out to be Garen's phone. The device was still powered on, though the battery was low, and it showed the same voicemail call in its recent activity. There were no additional recordings saved, but metadata confirmed the exact timestamp matched the call logs already reviewed. Further inside, the deputy noted faint markings along the wooden supports, thin grooves carved at different heights. Those grooves did not form words or symbols, but their spacing appeared intentional, repeating in uneven intervals. When he reached the far end of the crawlspace, he found something that forced him to stop and call for backup. There was a vertical drop cut into the earth, roughly 1 meter wide, descending beyond the reach of their initial lighting. The edges of the drop were reinforced with older wood, darker in color, suggesting it had been there far longer than the cabin above. A second camera was lowered into the opening, capturing a deeper shaft that extended into complete darkness. Audio from the camera picked up a faint echo, followed by a distant tapping sound that matched the pattern from the voicemail. At that point, the team withdrew and requested additional equipment, treating the location as a potential hazard zone. The next morning, investigators returned with proper gear, including stronger lights and breathing equipment for deeper entry. They documented the shaft more thoroughly, noting that its walls showed signs of manual digging rather than natural formation. Archived property records later revealed that the land had once been used for limited excavation in the early 1970s. However, no official record mentioned a shaft beneath the cabin, nor any structure that matched its current condition. As they prepared to descend, one investigator replayed the voicemail again, focusing on the moment Garen mentioned movement below. The timing aligned closely with when he would have been standing near the hatch, directly above the hidden opening. Investigators also noted the phrase he used near the end, interpreting it as a reaction rather than a random statement. Before lowering anyone further, they conducted a sound test, dropping a small object down the shaft to measure depth. The object struck something after several seconds, followed by a hollow echo that suggested a larger space below. Moments later, a faint tapping sound responded from within the darkness, repeating the same uneven rhythm captured earlier. That response was recorded on multiple devices, confirming it was not a playback artifact or environmental interference. At that point, the team halted the descent, shifting focus to understanding whether the sound indicated structural instability or something else. Back at the cabin level, another deputy re-examined the floorboards, noticing slight warping near where Garen had reportedly stood. The wood showed pressure marks from below, consistent with upward force applied repeatedly over a short period of time. No clear explanation was found for that pressure, and no mechanical source was identified in or around the cabin. As the investigation continued, attention returned to the voicemail, specifically the final seconds before it ended abruptly. Audio specialists enhanced the recording, isolating background noise that had not been cleared during initial playback. Within that segment, they detected a second voice, extremely faint, layered beneath the sound of wind and movement. The voice did not form complete words, but its cadence matched the tapping pattern heard both in the cabin and the shaft. That detail shifted the direction of the investigation, raising new questions about what Garen Pike encountered in that roadside cabin. By the third day, investigators shifted their focus from recovery to understanding what the shaft beneath the cabin actually was. They brought in a geological consultant who examined the soil composition and the structure of the vertical drop. His report suggested the shaft had been expanded over time, not in a single effort, with tool marks from different periods. That detail aligned with archived records from the early 1970s, but also hinted at more recent activity below. Despite the risks, a controlled descent was approved, using a harness system and continuous audio monitoring from above. The first investigator lowered into the shaft, moved slowly, calling out observations as he passed the reinforced sections. About 4 meters down, the walls widened slightly, revealing a chamber carved into the earth with uneven edges. His light swept across the space, illuminating scattered objects that appeared out of place in such an isolated location. There were fragments of wood, rusted metal pieces, and what looked like remnants of old tools partially buried in dirt. Then his voice changed, tightening as he described something positioned near the far side of the chamber. He said there was a vertical support beam, and beside it, markings carved into the surface at irregular intervals. Those markings resembled the grooves found in the crawl space above, but they were deeper and more numerous. As he moved closer, he paused, then reported finding fabric caught along the base of the beam. The fabric was later confirmed to match the material of Garen Pike's jacket, which he had been wearing that day. There were no signs of a struggle in the chamber, no scattered footprints beyond the initial entry path, but the soil near the beam showed compression, as if weight had been applied there repeatedly over a short time. While documenting the area, the investigator's audio feed picked up a faint tapping sound echoing from deeper within the earth. He stopped speaking for a moment, then said the sound was not coming from above, but from a lower point beyond the chamber. A second shaft was discovered behind the beam, narrower and partially concealed by loose soil and debris. This shaft descended further than the first, disappearing beyond the reach of their strongest light. The tapping continued, steady and uneven, matching the exact pattern recorded in the voicemail and earlier tests. At that point, the team above instructed him to withdraw, prioritizing safety over further exploration. As he began ascending, the tapping grew louder, no longer distant, but resonating through the walls around him. He reported feeling vibrations through the harness line, subtle at first, then stronger with each repeated sound. Halfway up, his audio feed captured something new, a faint voice layered within the tapping rhythm. The words were unclear, but the cadence matched the enhanced segment from Garen's final voicemail. When the investigator reached the surface, the team immediately sealed the opening, ending all descent operations. The site was classified as unstable, and further access was restricted pending a full structural assessment. Garen Pike was never recovered, and no definitive conclusion was reached regarding what happened inside that cabin. His phone remained the only direct record preserved as evidence, along with the enhanced audio analysis. Weeks later, one of the technicians reviewing the case revisited the voicemail using updated filtering software. He isolated the final seconds again, focusing on the layered voice beneath the tapping pattern. This time, the audio resolved more clearly, revealing a phrase repeated in a low, uneven tone. It said, "Not alone down here," followed by a pause, then the same phrase spoken again with slight variation. The technician noted that the second repetition did not match Garen's voice profile based on earlier recordings. That distinction raised a final question that remained unanswered in the official report. If the second voice was not Garen Pike, then something else had been speaking from beneath that roadside cabin. The case file was eventually closed without resolution, marked as an unexplained disappearance with unusual environmental factors. Years later, the cabin no longer stands, removed after structural concerns made the area unsafe for any further investigation. But the voicemail still circulates in archived files, often cited as one of the clearest recordings tied to a missing person case. And in that recording, just before the line goes silent, the tapping stops for a brief moment. In that silence, a voice can be heard, closer than before, repeating the same words as if answering his call. A hiker found a warning carved into the canyon wall. In late autumn of 2017, a lone hiker discovered a warning carved deep into a canyon wall. By the time investigators understood what it meant, several strange details from that day had already become impossible to explain. Ronan Hale was 34 years old and worked long night shifts as a freight supervisor at a regional distribution warehouse. On most weekends, he drove away from the city, looking for quiet trails where he could hike alone and clear his mind. That Saturday morning, he headed toward a remote stretch of canyonland several hours outside the nearest town. The place was known to locals for steep walls, narrow paths, and long sections where cell signals simply disappeared. Ronan preferred trails that few people visited because crowded parks always made the experience feel rushed and noisy. According to later interviews, he packed water, a small camera, trail snacks, and a folded topographic map inside his worn hiking bag. The trail he chose that day followed a dry riverbed before bending into a deeper section of canyon. By mid-morning, the sun hung high above the cliffs, casting sharp shadows that stretched across the dusty stone floor. At first, nothing unusual happened, and Ronan walked steadily while taking photos of unusual rock formations along the path. Around noon, the canyon narrowed sharply, forcing the trail close to a tall wall of pale stone. It was there that Ronan noticed something strange, cut into the rock several feet above the ground. At first, he assumed it was graffiti left by climbers, which sometimes appeared in isolated places like this. But when he stepped closer, the markings looked older and far more deliberate than simple carved initials. The letters were deep and uneven, like someone had spent a long time pressing a sharp tool into hard stone. Ronan brushed dust away with his hand and read the words slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. The message was short, only a single sentence carved into the canyon wall. It read, "Do not go farther. Turn back while you still can." At first, Ronan laughed quietly to himself, assuming the message was some kind of dramatic joke left by hikers. But something about the carving felt different, because the stone around the letters looked weathered and very old. The grooves held darker sediment that had settled over many seasons of rain and wind. It suggested the warning had been there much longer than the average trail marker or tourist graffiti. Ronan took several photos of the carving with his small camera before stepping back to examine the surrounding rock. There were no signatures, no dates, and no other markings nearby that explained who might have written the message. The trail continued deeper into the canyon, only a few yards past the carved warning. From where Ronan stood, the path curved slightly and disappeared behind a sharp bend in the stone walls. He checked his watch and considered turning around, mostly because the warning had unsettled him more than he expected. Still, curiosity pushed him forward, and the idea of a mysterious carving made the hike suddenly more interesting. Before continuing, Ronan scanned the ground carefully for footprints or signs of recent visitors passing through the narrow corridor. The dust looked mostly undisturbed, except for faint animal tracks weaving between scattered rocks along the canyon floor. No fresh boot prints appeared anywhere near the carved warning. That detail would later become one of the first things investigators wrote down in their notes. Ronan hesitated for another moment before lifting his camera again and recording a short video of the strange message. In the footage, his voice sounded calm, though later listeners noticed a hint of uncertainty in his tone. He quietly read the carved sentence aloud and joked that someone out there probably had a strange sense of humor. Then he turned the camera toward the trail ahead and began walking deeper into the canyon. For the next several minutes, the path remained silent, except for the steady sound of Ronan's boots against loose gravel. The canyon walls grew taller as he continued, blocking more sunlight and lowering the temperature noticeably. According to the timestamp on his camera footage, about 12 minutes passed after he left the carved warning behind. That was when Ronan stopped walking again and aimed the camera towards something farther ahead along the trail. At first, the video captured only stone and shadow, but then a shape slowly appeared near the base of the canyon wall. It looked like another carving, larger this time, etched into a darker section of rock several yards ahead. Ronan moved closer to read it clearly, unaware that the second message would soon make the first warning seem far less mysterious. Ronan Hale approached the darker section of stone with slow steps, holding the camera steady as he moved closer. The second carving was much larger than the first message he had discovered earlier along the narrow canyon trail. Unlike the first warning, this carving stretched across several feet of rock and looked hurried, almost desperate in appearance. The letters were uneven and deeper in some places, suggesting whoever carved them had worked quickly under pressure. Ronan stepped closer and wiped loose sand from the grooves with the side of his hand. The words slowly became clear as the dust fell away from the surface of the rock. The message read, "If you see this, someone ignored the first warning." For several seconds, Ronan said nothing, while the camera quietly recorded the carved sentence in sharp afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than before, and the casual tone from earlier had disappeared. He muttered that the place suddenly felt less like a hiking trail and more like the beginning of a strange story. Still, he continued walking slowly toward the bend in the canyon where the path narrowed even further. Investigators would later review the camera footage many times while studying the sequence of events from that afternoon. At first, nothing unusual appeared beyond the two carved warnings and Ronan's calm but cautious reactions. But a few minutes after passing the second carving, something else entered the frame briefly near the canyon floor. The camera caught a glimpse of what looked like a rusted metal object, partly buried under layers of dust. Ronan noticed it immediately and crouched down to brush away loose gravel from the small exposed corner. As he cleared more dirt, the shape slowly revealed itself as a narrow metal box. The box looked old and heavily weathered, with one side bent inward as if something heavy had struck it years earlier. Ronan turned the camera toward it while carefully lifting the lid, which opened with a dry scraping sound. Inside the box were several folded papers wrapped in a thin plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. There was also a small flashlight and what appeared to be an old cassette tape. Ronan pulled the papers out first and unfolded them while kneeling in the dust beside the canyon wall. The camera footage shook slightly as he adjusted his position to read the faded writing. The pages contained handwritten notes filled with rough sketches of the canyon and short lines of hurried instructions. One sentence appeared several times across the pages, written in thicker ink than the rest. It said, "Stay out of the narrow passage after the second bend." Ronan glanced up toward the trail ahead, where the canyon curved sharply out of view about 30 yards away. That bend matched the rough drawing on the paper almost perfectly. Another page described strange sounds echoing through the canyon at night, though the details were incomplete and difficult to read. The final page contained a short message that seemed written in a rush. It read, "If we do not come back, warn anyone who finds this." For a moment, Ronan simply stared at the paper while the wind pushed loose sand along the canyon floor. The quiet surroundings suddenly felt heavier, as if the walls around him were closing in slowly. He folded the papers again and placed them back inside the plastic sleeve before returning them to the metal box. Then he stood up and looked once more toward the bend, farther down the trail. The sunlight barely reached that section of canyon now, leaving the path ahead covered in long shadows. From where he stood, the narrow passage looked darker than the rest of the trail behind him. Ronan hesitated while considering whether the warnings were part of an elaborate prank or something more serious. Eventually, curiosity won again, and he decided to walk a little farther just to see what lay beyond the bend. He lifted the camera and continued down the path while recording everything around him in steady silence. The canyon grew noticeably tighter as he approached the place marked on the old map inside the metal box. Then, just before reaching the bend, Ronan stopped suddenly. Something else had been carved into the stone at eye level along the right side of the canyon wall. But this carving looked very different from the earlier warnings. Instead of words, the stone showed several deep vertical marks lined closely beside each other. Each mark was nearly a foot long and cut much deeper than any of the messages Ronan had already seen. The camera moved closer as Ronan leaned toward the strange markings for a better look. That was when a faint sound echoed somewhere beyond the bend ahead. At first, it was so quiet the camera microphone barely captured it. But Ronan heard it clearly enough to freeze where he stood. It sounded like a single rock sliding slowly across stone somewhere deeper inside the canyon. Ronan Hale remained completely still after hearing the faint sound echo through the narrow canyon corridor. For several seconds, the camera recorded nothing but the quiet wind moving dust across the rocky ground. He slowly turned his head toward the bend ahead, listening carefully for any sign that something else was moving nearby. The canyon remained silent, though the long walls around him carried even the smallest sound surprisingly far. Ronan whispered that it was probably a small animal knocking loose stones somewhere deeper along the trail. Still, his voice sounded less certain than it had earlier during the hike. He took a few cautious steps toward the bend while holding the camera steady in front of him. The strange vertical markings in the rock remained visible behind him as the path curved out of sight. Those marks would later become one of the most discussed details once investigators reviewed the footage. Each line looked sharp and deliberate, though no tool marks could be clearly identified in the video. When Ronan reached the bend, he paused again and slowly angled the camera around the corner first. The narrow passage opened into a slightly wider section of canyon covered with scattered stones and fallen debris. Nothing moved inside the open space at first glance. The ground looked uneven and sloped gently downward toward another darker corridor farther ahead. Ronan stepped forward carefully and continued recording as he walked into the wider clearing between the canyon walls. A few seconds later, the camera tilted suddenly toward the ground. Part of a human boot appeared in the dust several feet away near the base of the opposite wall. The rest of the shape slowly came into view as Ronan approached. Half buried beneath loose gravel was the skeletal outline of a hiking pack and what remained of a person beside it. The bones were scattered slightly, as if they had been exposed to years of harsh weather. Ronan stopped immediately and lowered the camera while staring at the discovery in stunned silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded quiet and shaken. He said someone must have gotten lost here a long time ago and never found their way back out. Then, he carefully stepped closer to examine the abandoned gear lying beside the remains. The backpack looked extremely old, with faded straps and cracked plastic buckles coated in thick canyon dust. Ronan noticed a small metal tag attached to one of the zippers. He brushed it clean with his thumb and read the faint lettering engraved across its surface. The tag carried a name and a year that had nearly worn away. The camera struggled to focus, but investigators later enhanced the frame during their analysis of the footage. The tag appeared to read a name, followed by the year 1998. That discovery matched the age of the rusted metal box Ronan had found earlier along the trail. It also matched the style of handwriting on the warning notes stored inside the plastic sleeve. For a moment, Ronan looked back toward the direction he had come from earlier that afternoon. The narrow bend now seemed much farther away than it had only minutes before. Then, another sound echoed faintly through the canyon behind him. This time, the noise was clearer than before and lasted slightly longer. It sounded like several small stones sliding down rock somewhere along the path Ronan had already walked. The camera shifted as he turned quickly toward the sound. The trail behind him remained empty, but dust drifted slowly in the air near the bend as if something had just moved through the passage. Ronan stared in that direction for several long seconds without speaking. Finally, he backed away from the skeletal remains and began walking toward the bend again. His footsteps grew faster as he returned along the narrow trail that led back toward the carved warnings. The camera footage shook more with each step as he moved through the tight canyon corridor. When Ronan reached the second carved message, he paused only briefly before continuing toward the first warning. The sunlight near the entrance of the canyon now appeared brighter than before. The last clear video clip ended as Ronan approached the original carved sentence in the canyon wall. The camera pointed directly at the words, telling hikers to turn back while they still could. The recording stopped abruptly a few seconds later. No further footage was found on the camera. Ronan Hale returned home later that evening and reported the discovery to local authorities the next morning. Search teams later recovered the remains inside the canyon and confirmed the person had died many years earlier. Investigators concluded the warnings were likely carved by members of an earlier hiking group searching for their missing friend. The metal box and written notes appeared to have been left as a final attempt to warn others. But one detail from Ronan's footage was never fully explained by those investigators. The drifting dust near the canyon bend suggested something had moved there moments before he looked back. Ronan himself later admitted he never returned to that trail again. He said the warnings had done exactly what they were meant to do. They made sure the next person who found them chose to leave. One line in the dispatch log changed the case. The case would later be defined by a single sentence typed during a quiet overnight shift. At the time, it looked like nothing more than routine documentation from a call that felt ordinary. The call came in just after 12:30 in the morning, when the county usually went silent. Maribel Crane had been a dispatcher for nearly 13 years, and she trusted patterns more than instincts. Most serious emergencies announce themselves clearly, with panic, noise, and urgency spilling through the line. This call did not. The man who called sounded winded but controlled, like someone trying to sound calm on purpose. He said he was driving home when his headlights caught a pickup truck down in a roadside ditch. The vehicle sat nose forward at an odd angle, with no lights on and no movement inside. Maribel asked for his location, and he hesitated before answering. He gave a mile marker, then corrected himself, then mentioned a service road nearby. She typed carefully, noting the changes without commenting on them. He said he walked up to the truck and looked through the driver's window. There was blood on the steering wheel, dark and dried in places. The driver was slumped forward, seatbelt on, and not responding. Maribel asked if he had checked for breathing. The man said no, he did not want to touch anything. His voice tightened slightly when he said it, then smoothed out again. She dispatched a patrol unit and volunteer medics, classifying the call as a single vehicle accident. As she worked through the checklist, she kept listening to the background noise on the line. There was wind, distant traffic, and nothing else. Just before hanging up, the man added something she had not asked about. He said the crash must have happened hours earlier because nobody else was around. Maribel paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She asked him why he thought the crash was old. The man hesitated, then said the truck just looked like it had been there a while. That answer felt thin, but not thin enough to challenge. Maribel asked one more question, keeping her tone neutral. She asked if the engine felt cold. The man said no, the engine was warm. There was a brief silence after that, the kind that lingered longer than expected. Maribel typed as he spoke, documenting the contradiction without comment. Caller reports engine warm despite belief crash occurred hours earlier. She closed the call and moved on, already answering another line. In her experience, small inconsistencies were common and usually meaningless. 11 minutes later, Deputy Alric Boone arrived at the scene. He was nearing the end of a long shift and hoped for a quick resolution. What he saw matched the report closely enough to satisfy him. The driver was identified as Roland Ives, age 46, a local mechanic. He was slumped forward in the seat with a visible head wound near his hairline. There were no skid marks, no broken signs, and no debris scattered across the road. The medic confirmed death at the scene, estimating it had occurred sometime earlier. With no obvious signs of foul play, the incident was logged as non-suspicious. The truck was towed, photos were taken, and traffic flowed again. By sunrise, the case was already settling into paperwork. It looked like another lonely death on a forgotten stretch of road. No witnesses, no clear cause, and no reason to look twice. Maribel returned for her next shift that night and barely remembered the call. The dispatch log remained unchanged, one line sitting quietly among dozens of others. 2 days later, that line would be read again, and nothing would be routine after that. 2 days after the crash, the file reached an investigator who did not trust summaries. Halden Pierce was 51, methodical, and known for rereading what others skimmed once. He believed most mistakes lived in margins, timestamps, and sentences people assumed were harmless. He read the report front to back, then opened the dispatch log. That was where he stopped. The line about the warm engine did not fit the timeline at all. If the crash happened hours earlier, the engine should have been cold. If the engine was warm, then the crash was recent or the truck was run afterward. Either option meant the initial conclusion was wrong. Halden requested the tow yard intake notes before doing anything else. The operator had written that the hood felt warm when he hooked the truck. He also noted the radio was playing a local station that signed off overnight. That detail mattered. The station stopped broadcasting just after midnight. If the radio was still on, the truck had been running not long before discovery. Halden pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest working intersection. It was miles away, grainy, and rarely useful, but he checked anyway. He found a pickup matching the truck passing through 20 minutes before the call. That erased the idea of a crash sitting unnoticed for hours. Someone had either been mistaken or someone had lied. Halden reclassified the case and requested the original caller information. The name was Keaton Rule, age 32, a local delivery driver. His record included minor theft and a previous false report years earlier. Halden brought Keaton in for a follow-up interview. Keaton appeared cooperative, but his answers drifted under pressure. He repeated the story, then adjusted small details without noticing. He said he was driving home, then later said he was heading out. He said the truck looked abandoned, then said he could see fresh blood. When asked about the engine, he avoided eye contact. Halden asked him directly why he believed the crash was old. Keaton said it was just a feeling, nothing specific. That answer did not survive silence. Phone records placed Keaton near the area earlier that night. They also showed his emergency call came from several miles away. That explained why nobody saw him at the scene. While Halden waited on more records, the autopsy report arrived. The medical examiner noted blunt force trauma inconsistent with a steering wheel impact. The wound suggested a heavy object, delivered with force from close range. Halden visited Roland Ives' garage the same afternoon. The place was orderly, with tools aligned and labeled. One space on the wall was empty, the outline of a tire iron visible in dust. Oil stains on the floor showed a recent vehicle movement. The pattern suggested the truck had been driven after an abrupt stop. It looked less like an accident and more like cleanup. Halden brought Keaton back in for a second interview. This time, the tone changed. Halden laid out the timeline slowly, one piece at a time. The warm engine, the radio station, the camera footage, the missing tool. Keaton listened, nodding, breathing shallow, saying nothing. When Halden finished, he slid the dispatch log across the table. He pointed to the single line typed by a dispatcher he had never met. Halden asked Keaton if the engine was warm because he had just shut it off. Keaton swallowed hard and stared at the table. He did not answer. The room stayed quiet longer than most people could tolerate. When Keaton finally looked up, his face had changed, and Halden knew the case was about to break open. Keaton broke the silence by asking for water, then pushed the cup away without drinking. His shoulders slumped, as if he had been holding himself upright by force alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and steadier than Halden expected. He said he knew Roland and that they had known each other for years. They had worked together briefly at a repair shop before money ruined the friendship. Roland had accused him of stealing tools, and the argument never fully died. On the night of the crash, Keaton went to Roland's garage to confront him. He claimed he only wanted to talk, but the discussion turned heated quickly. Words turned into shouting, and shouting turned into something neither planned. Keaton said Roland grabbed a tire iron from the wall, not to swing it, but to threaten him. Keaton reacted without thinking, striking first and harder than he realized. Roland fell backward, hit his head, and did not get back up. Keaton said he panicked when he realized Roland was not moving. He checked for breathing, found none, and felt the weight of what he had done. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision he thought would save him. He dragged Roland into the truck, buckled him in, and wiped down the garage floor. He drove the truck out to the highway, choosing a spot he thought looked accidental. He eased it into the ditch, careful not to leave skid marks. He left the engine running longer than intended, then shut it off and walked away. After driving several miles, he called emergency services and pretended to discover the crash. He believed distance would erase connection and time would erase doubt. What he did not consider was habit. He did not consider a dispatcher trained to document contradictions without judgment. He did not consider how machines recorded things people forgot. The confession aligned cleanly with the evidence already gathered. Phone records, camera footage, tool placement, and injury patterns matched his account. The case moved quickly once the story stopped changing. Keaton was charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering. He accepted a plea agreement months later, avoiding trial and a longer sentence. The final paperwork was sealed, and the case faded from public attention. Maribel Crane learned about the outcome through an internal bulletin. Her name was not mentioned, and her note was not highlighted. To her, it was just another closed call from years earlier. She continued working nights, answering phones, and typing details others overlooked. She never asked what happened to the cases that passed through her hands. She only believed that accuracy mattered even when nobody seemed to notice. Halden Pierce retired several years later. When asked about cases that stayed with him, he mentioned this one quietly. He said the truth often hides inside sentences people rush past. The crash was never what it appeared to be. It was not solved by a dramatic discovery or a single bold move. It was solved because one line did not match the story it belonged to. Long after the files were archived, that line remained unchanged. A simple observation typed during a quiet shift. One line in the dispatch log that changed the case.